In the 1900s, Native activists fought against a lack of reform as U.S. policies violated family sovereignty through boarding schools, mass sterilizations, and child removals. Activists revolutionized the public understanding of these abuses by vocalizing state violence. This led to the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act, which codified tribal authority over child welfare. While this reform is still incomplete in its enforcement, it has empowered Native communities to reclaim family sovereignty. In the late 19th century, the US government attacked Native family sovereignty through boarding schools. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Native children needed to be separated from their families to be civilized. They believed indigenous parenting was an obstacle to national progress. Institutions such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial Boarding School forcibly removed children from their homes, cut their hair, prohibited indigenous languages, and punished cultural expression. Furthermore, boarding schools conducted nutritional experiments on children by starving them of essential nutrients, such as milk, to test malnutrition. How long could a body go with certain vitamin or iron deficiencies? In fact, most of what modern medicine knows about nutrient deficiencies originated from boarding schools. In 1908, Carlisle Superintendent Moses Friedman dismissed a student's wish to return home, while federal officials rejected Theresa Greene's plea for her daughter's return. They stated that no sufficient reason existed to reunite the child with her family. This unchecked federal power meant Native families had no agency once their children entered boarding schools. Further, when families revolted, there was no meaningful reform. Instead, the federal government doubled down on its authority. In 1894, Hopi parents withdrew their children from school in protest of forced assimilation. The government reacted by deploying military troops to round up Hopi children and drop them at boarding schools. Over 104 children were kidnapped. The boarding schools marked a failure of reform for child welfare and family sovereignty. By World War II, the cost of running large off-reservation schools became harder to justify to American constituents. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act to phase out boarding schools. However, this wasn't a true reform. The federal government instead implemented a child welfare system that operated almost entirely without tribal oversight. By 1969, the Association on American Indian Affairs estimated that 35% of Native children were removed from their homes and placed in non-Native foster care without due process. Tribal communities had no say in the matter. To a non-Native social worker, leaving a child with extended relatives like grandparents seemed like mistreatment. They didn't understand the Native culture of communal childbearing. They were further appalled by the poverty in reservations. To social workers, an upper-class white family seemed to offer the child the best opportunities. So, rather than reforming underfunded reservations, limited access to healthcare, or housing insecurity, all conditions created by federal policies, the government funded child removal. Child welfare agencies, just like boarding schools, showed a lack of reform. They separated Native children from their families for assimilation. A Native child growing up in a white household would lose connection to their identity and have drastically higher rates of depression and alcoholism. Activist Marie Sanchez called child removal baby snatching. Furthermore, in the 1900s, control over indigenous families also expanded to regulating reproduction through coerced sterilization. The federal government continued to believe that Native families were a social problem, inherently unfit, and thus requiring state intervention. In 1927, the Supreme Court upheld compulsory sterilization in Buck v. Bell, where Justice Oliver Holmes declared, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." He was talking about regulating populations of impoverished non-white communities, specifically Native families. Forced sterilization became legitimized as public health care in Native communities. The Public Health Service Act of 1944 created the Indian Health Service and provided them with the medical infrastructure through which coerced sterilizations could occur. In 1973, a revolution was sparked in the work of Dr. Connie Redbird. A Native physician, she investigated and reported on the IHS's coerced sterilization practices in Oklahoma. She reported that these procedures had become so routine that over 100 Native women were sterilized at Claremore Indian Hospital in 1973 alone. Dr. Redbird's work revolutionized how people saw coerced sterilization by transforming private trauma into public, indisputable evidence. Unlike earlier accusations that could be dismissed as too anecdotal, Redbird coalesced internal records, patient histories, and procedural data. The indigenous journal Akwesasne Notes used Dr. Redbird's research to frame coerced sterilization as a form of medical genocide. This was an unprecedented, revolutionary move. For decades, sterilization was defended as public health, voluntary. Indigenous activists shattered this framing by proving sterilization was an intentional genocide. Widespread anger over coerced sterilization created momentum for broader advocacy across family sovereignty issues, specifically child welfare. The Women of All Red Nations, founded to advocate for reproductive justice, expanded their platform to child removals. They vocalized how the US government increasingly removed Native children from their homes by placing them in non-Native institutions without consent. The National Congress of American Indians lobbied for legal protections that would safeguard Native children. They advocated that it is in the best interest of a Native child to grow up in a Native household, and that tribal communities must be involved in welfare decisions. Chief Calvin Isaac of the Mississippi Band of Choctaws stated that culturally, the chance of Indian survival significantly reduces if our children are raised in non-Indian homes. Congress was confronted with overwhelming evidence that Native families were being systemically dismantled via child removal. In 1978, after sustained lobbying from Native activists, they passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, a landmark reform. It codified tribal jurisdiction and prioritized keeping Native children within their families and communities. Congress reacted positively to ICWA. They acknowledged the harms of welfare policies in House Report 95-1386. After lobbying from activists like Sandy Whitehawk, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act in 1996, a reform that allowed tribal communities to take control of programs that were previously run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Native communities could now operate their own education and social service programs according to their tribal priorities. However, Congress had pursued a safer path by passing ICWA. They avoided regulating the Indian Health Service and coerced sterilizations, which would have meant policing federal doctors. So the IHS continued mass sterilizations. In fact, the 1976 Hyde Amendment restricted abortions for Native women by banning federal funding. Most Native women relied on the IHS for healthcare. Yet over 20 years, the IHS performed only 24 abortions nationwide. There remained a lack of reform for Native women, as federal control over their bodies persisted years after ICWA. In 2007, inspired by ICWA, the UN Assembly passed the Indigenous Peoples' Right of Self-Determination. This reform articulated the rights of Indigenous communities globally to maintain their own child welfare systems. However, in the US, ICWA was incomplete. In a 2008 interview, ICWA activist Madonna Thunderhawks shared that states receive millions in federal funding for child welfare. Because of this incentive, states like South Dakota traffic Native children through their foster care. In 2020, more than 60% of America's foster children were Indigenous, even though Native children were only 11% of the population. The lack of reform had continued.
If you're getting money for fostering children that are not yours and you're not giving them access to what you're supposed to be giving access to, resources, heritage, culture, language, then you aren't really doing that individual justice when it comes to their overall well-being and sovereignty too.
Still, Native communities are leading progress. Activist Brian Nurnberger founded the Simply Smiles Children's Village on the Cheyenne River Reservation in 2008. A tribal-led foster care model, Simply Smiles keeps children within their community, exactly what ICWA intended to reform. The lack of reform in Native family sovereignty produced devastating consequences through US federal policies of boarding schools, child removals, and mass sterilization. However, Native activists revolutionized public perception of these practices in the 1960s and 70s, leading to the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Even though its enforcement needs work, ICWA remains a monumental reform that allowed Native communities to reclaim agency.